few years back when I was 17 years old, I went to a party. Everything was alright until the host started getting really intense and creepy. By that point, it was around 3 a.m. and I was pretty drunk. I decided to call an Uber in order to avoid any advances from this insistent guy. The Uber shows up, and I try to sober up when I got in. The driver starts making small talk with me, and in the state I was in, I failed to see any red flags. He starts to ask me about the party I was at, and I told him about the creep, and then he told me it was because I was short and cute. He then asked my age, and sensing a weird vibe from him, I told him I was a minor, thinking it would deter any further advances. And it turns out, that was a horrible idea. He was driving pretty recklessly on the highway, and I snapped out of my drunken stupor real fast. He then asked me to go get drinks with him that same night, and told me he really liked me. Quickly told him I'd get grounded if I stayed out any later, and that my mother was awake and waiting for me to get home. Keep in mind, I lived in Mexico, and the amount of people, and especially women, that get murdered daily is ridiculously high. When we got to my home address, I noticed that doors were locked, and he kept on insisting we go get a drink, even though by now it was almost 4 a.m. I tried to act as nice as possible when I told him I couldn't that night. He then asked for my phone number and told me that we could go out the next day. So, not being the first time that some creep had asked me for my number, I gave him my number but changed the last digit so he couldn't actually contact me. Then he actually dialed the number as I was getting out of the car. Of course, my phone didn't ring and he started getting agitated and said I gave him the wrong number. I played drunk and stupid and recited my number again, but actually said it correctly in order for him to think that he heard the last number wrong. He chuckled and said it was his bad and told me that we'd see each other the next day. I made my way into the house and immediately woke up my mom because I was terrified. She managed to calm me down and told me to go to sleep. So I went to my bedroom and started putting my pajamas on, when I heard my phone ringing. The Uber driver was trying to video call me, and I lost my shit when I saw that on my screen. I immediately denied the call and then noticed he'd sent me about 15 messages asking what time he could come pick me up the next day, and why wasn't I replying. Of course I blocked him right away and thought that would be the end of it. The next day I got a text from an unknown number and checked the picture and saw it was the same driver. He asked me why I blocked him and started spamming me. I immediately blocked him. Over the course of the next month, I'd get messages from random phone numbers, and it quickly became obvious that it was the same driver. I would always block him, but eventually I reported him on the Uber app and changed my number. The only problem is, he knows where I live. In Myrtle Beach in 2016, my boyfriend and I had ordered an Uber from our hotel to a restaurant. When you get an Uber, the type of car, a picture of the driver, and their name are usually visible on the app. We were waiting on an older gentleman driving a little white sedan to come get us when a dumpy-looking old van pulls up. There was a man behind the wheel, a man in the passenger seat, and two in the back. One of the men in the back slid the van door open and asked, "Are you Blake?" As soon as we saw how many people were in the van and that none of them were the picture of the man on the app, we immediately knew something was off. First off, Uber has a rule where you can't have any non-customer passengers in the car with you when making pickups. And second, the whole situation just felt a little fishy to both of us because nothing matched what the app said. My boyfriend lied and said we were not the ones that called an Uber, and they slammed the door and drove off. A few minutes later, our actual Uber driver pulls up. We told him what had happened, and he said it wasn't the first time he'd heard that from customers. I've never forgotten that, and wonder what would have happened had we gotten into that van that day. We have also never figured out how they knew my boyfriend's name. Unless they had hacked into Uber's database somehow, to access current Uber requests. If anyone has any ideas about how he would know his name, please let me know. Moral of the story is always be cautious if your Uber driver shows up, and the car and the driver do not match what the app says. When I was in college, I found myself Ubering to make money. This was in Southern California, and LA at the time was a constant flow of work. Occasionally, you'd pick up people in a nice area, and they'd tell you that they were sleeping with someone in a relationship, or that they themselves were cheating. This was depressingly common. I think that saying what they were doing to someone gave them some kind of weird relief. Once, I drove someone from Hollywood to Hemet, California. He was very charming and funny. When I dropped him off, it was at a big blue building that they buzzed us into. He left me a $200 cash tip. I later find out this is what is known as a gold base for the Church of Scientology. If you don't know what that is, it is a completely normal, not weird at all in any way location owned by a Church of Scientology. Feel free to Google it. A few months into my taxi career, insurance companies start using rideshare service, and some people who were more down on their luck would use it. Sometimes this was just people trying to get their kids to school, but sometimes it was way sadder. I can't tell you how many times I show up to a doctor's office to see someone with accessibility limitations, face drop at seeing my tiny car instead of a van like they needed. The people with substance problems were interactions that would stay with you. Once I picked up a man going to a dental appointment, and I drove him for about a half an hour. He told me about how he used to run drugs in the 90s until they caught him with a few pounds of coke. He told me about when he moved from Nevada to Florida for trial, and how he traveled handcuffed in a van, how the cops would stop only once a day at McDonald's for only their dollar menu item of the day. He asked me to stop at a liquor store, and he chugged a tiny bottle of booze, shoved mints in his mouth, then sipped on a soda. He smelled like pure alcohol when I dropped him off at the dentist. Near my house, there was a methadone clinic. I would get up before dawn and be able to take those rides. Almost always they were sweet and thankful. Sometimes they were a little out of it, but I never felt in danger or anything like that. Just good people going through tough times. These rides were the most consistently depressing. People who were going to court, clearly drunk or high. Older women who had trouble requesting a ride and had been waiting in the parking lot of their dialysis place into the night. They'd tell their stories sometimes. A person who was going to court for child custody case. People struggling with mental illness. Some mornings were exhausting. Being up that early, you'd hit another crowd that I never anticipated. Funeral goers. The saddest funeral ride was when a man and a woman got into my back seat. Rather than speaking to me, the man handed me a neon printout of a map of a cemetery, with instructions on what plot to go to. With, "Hello, I am attending my father's funeral. My wife and I are deaf. Please follow these instructions," written on the back of it. The whole ride I could hear them singing to one another and trying not to cry. There were also retired gamblers. Leave their houses at 7 in the morning, take a $70 Uber out into the desert, and spend the whole day gambling at the reservation casinos. The desert is where I saw some of the weirdest things. The desert was the only place I ever felt scared driving. It was in Temecula, the wine country of SoCal. Lots of wooded roads and desert. I picked up a lady just off the freeway at what I initially assumed was the edge of a golf resort. But it was an unpaved access road. It was late, and that area was especially dark. I was getting ready to call the passenger when I saw them coming down the unpaved access road. It was a tall blonde woman in a very nice pantsuit. She was absurdly put together considering she had just walked God knows how long in those heels down a dirt rock road. She got into the car and was very pleasant. She said she lived in a gated community and that was hard to get Ubers to, and it was easier to send me to the access road. Thought it was weird, but I didn't want to be creepy asking about where she lived. She was friendly, chatty even. She was going to a dinner party, and as soon as she spoke to me, I could feel her looking at me in the rearview mirror the entire ride. Drove a half an hour away from the freeway, to one of those rural chic neighborhoods that you would hear celebrities had huge parties at. Eventually, we reached the address, which was a paved-line road with trees. She told me to keep driving, and I didn't think much of it because, again, we were in a mansion-style neighborhood. We hit a white ranch-style fence after a minute or so going down the road. It's when I started to feel a little bit uneasy. There were around a dozen no trespassing signs, and one of those classic, "Forget the dog, beware the owner" signs, with a guy pointing a pistol at you. I thought it was more than a little blunt to have that many signs, but hey, not my property. We drove for about a minute when we came to another fence. It was at the top of a hill and overlooked a barn with some lights in the distance. I know this sounds weird, but it was unpleasant. I couldn't put my finger exactly on it. It was just a barn with what looked like a barbecue going. About being out in the woods without any light had me freaked out. The passenger told me I could just slide the gate open. As I approached the fence, I saw some signs that made me stop cold. Off the side of the gate, not quite in the dark, but on the fringes of my headlights, there were metal signs with bullet holes in them, swastikas and Confederate flags brightly displayed. SoCal has a lot of white supremacist pockets. I've dropped off dozens of passengers in cities like Norco, and driven down streets with people drinking in their garage. And a Nazi flag proudly hung behind them. It wasn't my favorite, but I wasn't spending any time in those neighborhoods, more than I needed to. This was different though. It was after 11 p.m. at night. I had no idea where I was. I opened up the gate, and down the road I saw what I assumed were cell phone flashlights lighting up to come up the incline. This made me very uncomfortable. I went back and I told the woman that I didn't think my car could make it up the hill if I went down it. "What are you talking about? Just take me, it's right there." She was getting more heated, and I could see the lights slowly making their way up the hill. She kept telling me I needed to cancel the ride, and that she wouldn't pay to not be taken the entire way. I told her the pin I was supposed to take her to was a mile back up the road, but I was so nervous I relented and canceled on my end. She slammed the door as she got out. I took off before I could see the cell phone light people get closer. The road back was much rougher at the speed I was going at. I felt a bump that felt like I hit a body, but I kept going. My car was driving like shit, but I kept driving till I was way past that fence, out of the rich neighborhood, and until I stopped at a gas station. My right rear tire was fucked up, and I needed to change it. There's a few nails that looked like they had been attached to a piece of wood on my tire. I was freaked out so hard, and sometimes I wish I had called the cops to report it. But of course, all that happened was I got a flat on a back road, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my night waiting on a cop car. I know it's far more likely that I freaked myself out than a bunch of Nazis planning to mess with a random Uber driver. When I pick up a well-dressed businesswoman from a remote location and drop her off at a separate remote location, it gives me chills that I still have trouble explaining to this day.
I live in a city with public transportation system. They've been extremely short-staffed, and more often than not, you have to call to make sure your bus is even coming. On weekdays during business hours, the public transit operator will order a Lyft for you to get to work if your bus isn't showing up, or if they're short a driver. Tuesday, I'm at the bus stop after checking multiple times if my bus is coming, only to find out that it wasn't. He ordered me a Lyft, and this nice older gentleman was my driver. We had a casual conversation, and he started to ask personal questions. I'm a bartender, and I'm super friendly already, so I didn't think his questions were ill-intentioned. I told him that I wasn't married, and that I'm pretty much a loner. Basically go to work and go home and spend time with family. He then says, "I'd marry you in a heartbeat." Again, I'm just thinking he's being nice or funny. I asked him to drop me off at the downtown grocery, so I could pick up some things I needed for work. When we stopped, he said he was joking and that he's married and has a son my age. Asked if I was interested in maybe meeting him. Since I have a terrible track record, I figured it wouldn't hurt meeting someone out of my circle and comfort zone, so I gave the man my number and we parted ways. The next morning, he texted me and asked me if I needed a ride to work. I told him he didn't have to do that since I was sure my bus was running. He said it would be his pleasure and he'd pick me up at my house around 3 p.m. Then about an hour later, he asked if I wanted to have lunch with him before work. Told him that I was busy and that I couldn't do that. He said, "Okay, see you at 3. He shows up at 3, lets me know he's outside. While I'm finishing getting my things together, I open the door and he's starting to walk up my stairs to my house. I told him I was ready and that we could head downtown. When I get in the back seat, he turns around and said he has a confession. He told me from the time I took off my mask, his heart danced like a butterfly. He said that he hasn't been able to stop thinking about me since the day before, and that he'd love to spend some time with me, and that he'd pay for my whole time if I spent the day with him. It's when I started to feel super uncomfortable. The whole ride was making me cringe, but I know when you're in a situation like that with a predator, playing nice is safer than freaking out. He continued on the entire ride about how he loved me at first sight, and wanted to make me his Lebanese queen. As we got closer to downtown, I started to feel a little bit more relieved. He dropped me off at my hotel and said, "See you tomorrow." That evening at work, I checked my phone after a bust happy hour, and he's texted me a couple of times. He sent a picture of the hotel and said he'd wait for me to get off and give me a ride home. Told him that I already had a ride, but thank you anyways. Thursday morning, I'm out running errands with my mom and my sister. He texts me and asks how early he can pick me up because he can't stop thinking about me. I asked him to please stop and that I was with family. He continues to text me all day and evening, begging to see me, telling me his heart is aching to see his Lebanese queen. And all I kept doing was just telling him to please stop. On Friday morning, shit hit the fan. He tells me he loves me no matter what. He said that I told my wife about you and that I'm in love with you and I want a divorce. I told him to please don't do that and it wasn't right to treat his wife that way. He said it wasn't my fault, that they were drifting apart anyways. He then said, I'm picking you up around 5:30 for dinner and I'm not taking no for an answer. I ignored the messages during the day and just went about my day off. Around 5:25, my video doorbell rings and he's standing on my porch for at least 15 minutes. I told him I wasn't home and that he should leave. He continues to text me and beg to come pick me up from my parents. I was home the whole time, but I was too scared to let him know that. Eventually, I called the non-emergency police station, but he had already left by that time. I filed a general report, but technically they can't do anything unless he's standing on my porch threatening me. They advised me to report him through Lyft, so I did. Haven't heard anything since, but that shit was just creepy as fuck. This happened several months ago. At the time, I had recently lost my car due to a motor vehicle accident. So I walked for 30 minutes to the store, thinking I'd be able to beat the sunset back. But I was wrong. By the time I was done picking up my grocery, it was pitch black outside. The thing is, I live in a woodsy area where there are not many sidewalks, so I didn't think it was safe to walk back. I tried getting my brother and cousin to come pick me up and drop me off, but they wouldn't have been able to make it for a while, so instead, I just decided to get a Lyft. A photo of a suspicious-looking creepy old man popped up as my driver. I waited on the sidewalk for my ride, and maybe 10 minutes later, the driver did. It was a silver Toyota sedan, and the driver was an old man wearing a cap and large frame rectangular glasses. Instantly, I felt something off about the man's aura. Tried not to let it bother me too much. After all, my home is literally down the street. I asked him if I could set my groceries in the trunk of his car. He nodded. I dropped it in without noticing what was in the trunk of his vehicle because where we were stopped. It was pretty dark with no street lamps. I helped myself into the car and told him that I lived back there, pointing in the direction from which the vehicle had arrived, and let him know that he was only about a 3-minute drive from my house. I saw him nod, or at least I thought so. As soon as the light switched green, he made a right. I thought he was making the right to turn the vehicle around, but instead, he drove past the main road he was supposed to take to get to my house. I let him know immediately that my home was that way while pointing in the direction, and he acknowledged it, but still kept going straight, claiming there was an issue with his GPS. He started driving us in the complete opposite direction of my home, where the roads were completely empty. I suddenly didn't feel safe, and I had a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. In that moment of panic, I immediately reached for my phone to SOS, assuming the worst, but then I stopped myself and told myself to calm down. Make a U-turn, I tried to tell the driver as calmly as possible. I didn't want him to hear the panic in my voice, and he didn't respond. My request to turn around was completely ignored. I couldn't keep calm anymore, so I finally yelled for him to make a right and turn around. He reluctantly complied. Along the way back to the road that took me to my home, it felt like the longest 3 minutes of my life. Just when I thought that I'd finally be home safe, the driver then suggested an alternate route, even though my house was simply a right and another right, via the main road and very close by. I immediately felt that something was really, really wrong now. He slowed down to a woodsy, isolated path along the way, asking if I'd ever been that way before, and we could just take this route instead. I froze. Again, I went into panic mode, but forced myself to calm down, so as not let it to be known that I was suspicious of him. I raised my voice once more, telling him my home was that way, while pointing towards the main road, which wasn't that far. He finally obliged after some reluctancy. Started driving back toward the main road again. The entire time on the way home, my heart was racing and my palms were sweating. We arrived to my complex maybe 5 minutes later, and I spoke to him very nicely so they didn't try something funny that would force him to react in such a manner that would put my life in further danger. I told him I'd be tipping him well for such a short drive, which would be $10. Quickly hopped out of the car and jolted to the trunk to retrieve my grocery. As I grabbed my bags, I saw something that I hadn't noticed before, because this time the street lamps surrounding my complex illuminated the trunk of his car. I froze as I grabbed my groceries. In the back of his trunk was a rope, a mallet, and a bag filled with some contents. I was trembling from fear. I ran up to my building so fast and checked outside my window as soon as I got up to my apartment to make sure he wasn't still lurking and watching. But thankfully, I never had to hear or see from that old man again. My guess was that he had some evil, twisted intentions from which I miraculously escaped, because for whatever reason, he decided to change his mind about the intentions he had. To this day, I can still only guess what his intentions were, but judging by the items I found in the trunk of his vehicle, it's not something I would have ever wished to find out about. I was so glad I trusted my instinct that day. One day, I, a 25-year-old female, had to get a Lyft home from work. The driver was a normal-looking dude in his 30s or so. We made normal conversation for the first few minutes about work and such. Then he randomly said something like, "Lyft and Uber can be pretty unsafe for young women." Instant alarm bells start going off, and it was just how he said it. He was trying to pass it off as a normal conversation tone, but you could hear the creepiness behind it. He then started driving really fast, and I got even more freaked, but tried not to give him the satisfaction of showing it. He started going on a tirade about other female riders he's had, or how they were chatty about dumb stuff like makeup, and that I seemed smart and friendly and different. He seemed to be trying to hide his anger for women in general. I was just replying to him and trying to make it out okay. After 15 minutes long of him speeding, we're finally at my home. I get out of the car, and that's when I fully process what had just happened, and my brain gives me permission to finally freak out. I feel shaken and report him. I doubt myself at first, because he was really just trying to pass all of this off as normal conversation. Lyft investigates it, and a month or so later, I get a random 1-star rating on my rider profile. I'm guessing it was him, wanting to get back at me. So creepy Lyft driver, let's not meet again. And Lyft was wrong for letting you back on. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. Also, if you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. As always, please leave a comment below of a theme you'd like to hear next. I'm always in need of more stories, so if you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email. All the links are below. Thank you so much for all your support, as I'm a very new channel and new to the narration scene in general. I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.